Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in Danny, the Champion of the World. The peasants started waking up. And now it looks like the jig is up. Game's up for them. I want to know what happens next, really, since I've never read this book. But, about to find out now. You ready? Alright. Let's begin again. Chapter 20. Goodbye, Mr. Hazel. Uh-oh. The big shiny silver Rolls Royce had braked suddenly and come to a stop right along the filling station. Behind the wheel, I could see the enormous pink, beery face of Mr. Victor Hazel staring at the pheasants. I could see the mouth hanging open, the eyes bulging out of his head like toadstools, and the skin of his face turning from pink to bright scarlet. The car door opened, and out he came, resplendent in fawn-colored riding breeches and high-polished boots. There was a yellow silk scarf around his neck with red dots on it, and he had a sort of bowler hat on his head. The great shooting party was about to begin, and he was on his way to greet the guests. He left the door of the Rolls open and came at us like a charging bull. My father, Doc Spencer, and I stood close together in a little group waiting for him. He started shouting at us the moment he got out of the car, and he went on shouting for a long time after that. I'm sure you would like to know what he said, but I cannot possibly repeat it here. The language he used was so foul and filthy it scorched my ear holes. Words came out of his mouth that I had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Little flecks of white foam began forming around his lips and running down his chin onto the yellow silk scarf. I glanced at my father. He was standing very still and very calm, waiting for the shouting to finish. The color was back in his cheeks now, and I could see the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile around the corners of his eyes. Doc Spencer stood beside him. He was also very calm. He was looking at Mr. Hazel rather as one would look at a slug on a leaf of lettuce in the salad. I myself did not feel quite so calm. "But they are not your pheasants," my father said at last. "They are mine." "Don't lie to me, man!" yelled Mr. Hazel. "I'm the only person around here who has pheasants." "They are on my land," my father said quietly. "They flew onto my land, and so long as they stay on my land, they belong to me. Don't you know the rules, you bloated old blue-faced baboon?" Oh, roasted big time. Doc Spencer started to giggle. Mr. Hazel's skin turned from scarlet to purple. His eyes and his cheeks were bulging so much with rage it looked as though someone was blowing up his face with a pump. He glared at my father, and he glared around at the dopey pheasants swarming all over the filling station. "What's the matter with them?" he shouted. "What have you done to them?" At this point, pedaling grandly towards us on his black bicycle, came the arm of the law in the shape of Sergeant Enoch Samways, resplendent in his blue uniform and shiny silver buttons. It was certainly a mystery to me how Sergeant Samways could sniff out trouble wherever it was. Let there be a few boys fighting on the sidewalk or two motorists arguing over a dented fender, and you would bet your life the village policeman would be there within minutes. We all saw him coming now, and a little hush fell upon the entire company. Imagine the same sort of thing happens when a king or a president enters a room full of chattering people. They all stop talking and stand very still as a mark of respect for a powerful and important person. Sergeant Samways dismounted from his bicycle and threaded his way carefully through the mass of pheasants squatting on the ground. The face behind the big black mustache showed no surprise, no anger, no emotion of any kind. It was calm and neutral, as the face of the law should always be. For a full half-minute, he allowed his eyes to travel slowly around the filling station, gazing at the mass of pheasants squatting all over the place. The rest of us, including even Mr. Hazel, waited in silence for judgment to be pronounced. "Well, well, well," said Sergeant Samways at last, puffing out his chest and addressing nobody in particular. What, may I ask, is happening around here? What, may I ask, is happening around here? Sergeant Samways had a funny habit of sometimes putting the letter H in front of words that shouldn't have an H there at all. And as to balance things out, he would take away the H from words that should have begun with that letter. So instead of saying, what, may I ask, is happening around here, he says, what, may I ask, is happening around here. He must have a Lancaster. He must be from Lancaster. I'll tell you what's happening around here, shouted Mr. Hazel, advancing upon the policeman. These are my pheasants, and this rogue, pointing at my father, has enticed them out of my woods onto his filthy little fitting station. Enticed? Said Sergeant Samways, looking first at Mr. Hazel, then at us. Enticed them, did you say? Of course he enticed them. Well now, said the sergeant, propping his bicycle carefully against one of our pumps. That is a very interesting accusation. Very interesting indeed, because I ain't ever heard of anybody enticing a pheasant across 6 miles of field and open countryside. How do you think this enticing was performed, Mr. Hazel, if I may ask? Don't ask me how he did it, because I don't know, shouted Mr. Hazel. But he's done it all right. The proof is all around you. All my finest birds are sitting here in this filthy little filling station, when they ought to be up in my own wood getting ready for the shoot. The words poured out of Mr. Hazel's mouth like a hot lava from an erupting volcano. Am I correct, said Sergeant Samways? Am I absolutely accurate in thinking that today is the day of your great shooting party, Mr. Hazel? That's the whole point, cried Mr. Hazel, stabbing his forefinger into the sergeant's chest as though he were punching a typewriter or an adding machine. And if I don't get these birds back on my land quick sharp, some very important people are going to be extremely angry this morning, and one of my guests, I'll have you know, Sergeant, is none other than your own boss, the Lord Chief Constable of the county. So you'd better do something about it fast, hadn't you, unless you want to lose those sergeant's stripes of yours. Sergeant Samways did not like people poking their fingers in his chest, least of all Mr. Hazel, and he showed it by twitching his upper lip so violently that his mustache came alive and jumped about like some small bristly animal. Now, just 1 minute, he said to Mr. Hazel. Just 1 minute, please. Am I to understand that you are accusing this gentleman of committing this act? Of course I am, cried Mr. Hazel. I know he did it. And do you have any evidence to support this accusation? The evidence is all round you, shouted Mr. Hazel. Are you blind or something? Now my father stepped forward. He took one small pace to the front and fixed Mr. Hazel with his marvellously bright, twinkly eyes. Surely you know how the pheasants came here, he said softly. Surely I do not know how they came here, snapped Mr. Hazel. That I shall tell you, my father said, because it is quite simple, really. They all knew they were going to be shot today if they stayed in your wood, so they flew in here to wait until the shooting was over. Rubbish! Yelled Mr. Hazel. It's not rubbish at all, my father said. They are extremely intelligent birds, pheasants. Is that so, Doctor? They have tremendous brain power, Doc Spencer said. They know exactly what's going on. It would undoubtedly be a great honour, my father said, to be shot by the Lord Chief Constable of the county, and an even greater one to be eaten afterward by Lord Thistlethwaite. But I do not think a pheasant would see it that way. You're scoundrels, both of you, shouted Mr. Hazel. You are rapscallions of the worst kind. Haven't heard that insult in a while. Now then, said Sergeant Samways, insults aren't going to get us nowhere. They only aggravate things. Therefore, gentlemen, I have a suggestion to put before you. I suggest that we all of us make a big effort to drive these birds back over the road on to Mr. Hazel's land. How does that strike you, Mr. Hazel? It'll be a step in the right direction, Mr. Hazel said. Get on with it, then. How about you, William? The sergeant said to my father. Are you agreeable to this action? I think it's a fine idea, my father said, giving Sergeant Samways one of his funny looks. I'll be very glad to help. So will Danny. What's he up to now, I wondered, because whenever my father gave somebody one of his funny looks, it meant something funny was going to happen. And Sergeant Samways, I noticed, also had quite a sparkle in his usually stern eye. Come on, my lads, he cried, let's push these lazy birds over the road. And with that he began striding around the filling station, waving his arms at the pheasants, shouting, Shoo! Shoo! Off you go! Beat it! Get out of here! My father and I joined him in this rather absurd exercise. For the second time that morning, clouds of pheasants rose up into the air, clapping their enormous wings. It was then I realized that in order to fly across the road, the birds would first have to fly over Mr. Hazel's mighty Rolls Royce, which lay right in their path with its one door still open. Most of the pheasants were too dopey to manage this, so down they came again, smack on top of the great silver automobile. They were all over the roof and the hood, sliding and slithering and trying to keep a grip on that beautifully polished surface. I could hear their sharp claws scraping into the paintwork as they struggled to hang on, and already they were depositing their filthy droppings all over the roof. Don't you just hate when that happens? Get them off! Screamed Mr. Hazel. Get them away! Don't you worry, Mr. Hazel, sir, Sergeant Samways cried out. We'll fix them for you. Come on, boys. Easy does it. Shoo 'em over the road. Not on my car, you idiot! Mr. Hazel bellowed, jumping up and down. Send them the other way! We will, sir, we will, answered Sergeant Samways. In less than a minute, the Rolls was literally festooned with pheasants, all scratching and scrabbling and making their disgusting runny messes over the shiny silver paint. What is more, I saw at least a dozen of them fly right inside the car through the open door by the driver's seat. Whether or not Sergeant Samways had cunningly steered them in there himself, I didn't know, but it happened so quickly that Mr. Hazel never even noticed. Get these birds off my car! Mr. Hazel shouted. Can't you see they're ruining the paintwork, you madman? Paintwork? Sergeant Samways said. What paintwork? He had stopped chasing the pheasants now, and he stood there looking at Mr. Hazel and shaking his head sadly from side to side. We've done our very best to encourage these birds over the road, he said, but it ain't worked. My car, man, shouted Mr. Hazel. Get them away from my car. Ah, the sergeant said, your car. I see what you mean. Yes, I see what you mean, man. Beastly, dirty birds, pheasants are. Why don't you just hop in quick and drive away fast? They'll have to get off then, won't they? Mr. Hazel, who seemed only too glad for an excuse to escape from this madhouse, made a dash for the open door of the Rolls and leapt into the driver's seat. The moment he was in, Sergeant Samways slammed the door, and suddenly there was the most infernal uproar inside the car as a dozen or more enormous pheasants started squawking and flapping all over the seats and around Mr. Hazel's head. Drive on, Mr. Hazel, sir, shouted Sergeant Samways through the window in his most commanding policeman's voice. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up! Get going, quick! Ignore them pheasants, Mr. Hazel, and accelerate that engine. Mr. Hazel didn't have much choice. He had to make a run for it now. He started the motor, and the great Rolls shot off down the road with the clouds of pheasants rising up from in it in all directions. Then an extraordinary thing happened. The pheasants had flown up off the air, stayed off the car, stayed up in the air. They didn't come flapping drunkenly down as we had expected them to. They stayed up and kept on flying. Over the top of the filling station they flew, and over the caravan, and over the field at the back where our little outdoor lavatory stood, and over the next field, and over the crest of the hill, until they disappeared from sight. Great Scott! Doc Spencer cried. Just look at that! They've recovered! The sleeping pills have worn off at last! Now all the other pheasants around the place were beginning to come awake. They were standing up tall on their legs and ruffling their feathers and turning their heads quickly from side to side. One or two of them started running about. Then all the others started running, and when Sergeant Samways flapped his arms at them, the whole lot took off into the air and flew over the filling station and were gone. Suddenly there was not a pheasant left, and it was very interesting to see that none of them had flown across the road, or even down the road in the direction of Hazel's wood and the great shooting party. Every one of them had flown in exactly the opposite direction. Aha! To be continued.